Ethan pulled the hood of his jacket tighter as the wind cut across the empty road. The sky hung low and heavy, the kind of gray that made everything feel smaller. Lily walked beside him, her hands buried deep in her sleeves, her breath puffing out in pale clouds. They had been walking for hours, but neither of them complained. Complaining felt useless now. Behind them, the orphanage stood silent and cold. A brick building with peeling paint and windows that always looked darker than they should. It wasn't cruelty that drove them away. It was something quieter. The constant waiting. Waiting to be noticed. Waiting for someone to care. Waiting for a future that never seemed to come. Ethan was 17 and already felt older than most adults he knew. He had learned how to be careful, how to stay invisible. Lily, 14, still carried a stubborn spark in her eyes. She believed in things Ethan no longer trusted, like luck and second chances. They followed an old service road that curved toward a stretch of pine forest just outside a dying farm town called Red Hollow. The trees stood tall and indifferent, their branches coated in thin layers of frost. As daylight faded, Ethan spotted something half buried in snow near a fallen fence. A sunken storage pit, maybe once used for crops or animals. Its wooden roof sagged inward, covered in moss and brittle straw. He stopped. That might work. Lily knelt and brushed snow away from the entrance. Inside, the space was cramped but dry. The walls were packed dirt, solid and quiet. No wind, no echo of footsteps, just stillness. "It smells like old wood," Lily said. "Not like the place we left." Ethan gave a tired smile. "That's an upgrade." They spent the next hour clearing debris with their hands and a broken shovel they found nearby. Lily gathered straw from the collapsed barn down the hill and spread it across the floor like a thin mattress. Ethan patched holes in the roof with scraps of wood and frozen mud, sealing out the worst of the cold. His fingers went numb, but he didn't stop. By the time night fell, the pit looked less like a hole and more like a shelter. They had no stove, no food, no real plan, but they had something they hadn't had before, a place that was theirs. Lily tied a piece of rope across the entrance for hanging wet socks and gloves. "We're pioneers now," she said softly. Ethan laughed under his breath. "Pioneers usually have wagons. Then we're the budget version." They sat side by side on the straw, wrapped in a single blanket. The cold still crept in through the dirt walls, but it didn't feel as sharp anymore. "Do you think they'll come looking for us?" Lily asked. "Maybe," Ethan said, "but not tonight." Outside, the wind pushed through the trees, whispering through frozen needles. Inside, the silence felt different. Not empty, just waiting. Lily rested her head against his shoulder. "We'll figure it out. We always do." Ethan stared at the dark ceiling above them. For the first time in years, he wasn't counting rules or footsteps or days. He was thinking about tomorrow, about work, about fire, about how to make this place warm. They weren't running anymore. They were building something. And for two kids with nothing but a blanket and a hole in the ground, that felt dangerously close to hope. Morning came slowly, gray and bitter. Frost clung to the inside of the shelter like a thin skin of ice, and Ethan woke with stiff fingers and a dull ache in his shoulders. Lily was already sitting up, rubbing her hands together and blowing warm air into her sleeves. "Still standing," she said, glancing at the patched roof. "Barely," Ethan replied, "but it held." They stepped outside into a world that looked even colder than the night before. Red Hollow sat in the distance, a cluster of tired buildings huddled near the highway. Smoke drifted from a few chimneys, thin and weak against the sky. "We need food," Lily said, "and something that burns." So they walked. The town was quiet in the early hours. A grocery store with a flickering sign, a hardware shop with rusted tools in the window, a diner that smelled faintly of coffee and grease. People noticed them right away. Two thin kids in worn jackets, boots dusted with snow. Ethan stopped outside the hardware store and waited until the owner came out to sweep the sidewalk. "Sir," he said, keeping his voice steady, "do you need help with anything? We can work." The man looked them over, slow and careful. "Where are you staying?" "Out by the old farm road." The broom paused. "That pit in the ground?" Lily stiffened, but Ethan nodded. "For now." The man grunted. "I've got firewood that needs splitting. You work, I'll give you supplies. No cash." "That's fine," Ethan said quickly. They spent the morning behind the store, splitting logs until their arms burned. Lily stacked the wood in crooked piles, her breath coming fast and white. By noon, their hands were raw, but they were given a sack of flour, a can of beans, and, best of all, a dented cast iron stove that had been sitting unused in the back shed for years. "You'll need a pipe for it," the man warned. "And don't burn your roof down." They dragged it back on a sled made from scrap boards and rope. By the time they reached the shelter, the sun was low, and their legs shook with every step. Ethan dug a shallow pit for the stove, while Lily cleared a corner and lined the walls with straw and pieces of cardboard she'd scavenged from town. When the stove finally sat in place, it looked almost proud in the small space. They didn't light it yet. They didn't have enough wood. Over the next few days, they fell into a routine. Walk into Red Hollow, work for food, carry everything back before dark. Ethan hauled water and chopped wood. Lily cleaned kitchens and mended torn coats for women who paid her in bread and canned soup. People talked. "Those kids won't last the winter. Living underground like animals. They should go to the church and beg for a bed." Lily heard it in the grocery store. Ethan heard it at the gas station. They never answered. At night, Ethan reinforced the roof with extra boards and packed the cracks with frozen mud. Lily hung a curtain made from an old tarp across the entrance to block the wind. They strung a rope for drying socks and gloves. They stacked firewood along one wall like bricks. It wasn't pretty, but it was theirs. One evening, as they sat on the straw floor eating warm beans from a shared cup, Lily said, "They look at us like we already failed." Ethan poked at the stove with a stick. "Let them." She hesitated. "What if they're right?" He met her eyes. "Then we prove them wrong." Outside, the wind rattled the trees. Inside, the stove was still cold, but the shelter felt different now. Less like a hiding place, more like the beginning of something solid. They didn't belong in Red Hollow yet, but they were learning how to stand in it. By the end of the first week, the cold had learned all their weak spots. It crept through the roof seams. It pressed up from the dirt floor. It slipped under the tarp curtain at the entrance and settled into their bones at night. Even with the little cast iron stove sitting in the corner, the shelter lost heat too fast to stay warm for long. Ethan noticed it first. "The fire burns hot," he said one evening, watching the flames climb straight up into the pipe opening he'd cut through the roof. "But the warmth doesn't stay." Lily pulled her blanket tighter around her shoulders. "It's like pouring soup through a fork." They stared at the stove for a long moment, listening to it crackle and pop. "What if we slow it down?" Lily asked. "The heat. Make it stay inside longer." Ethan thought about it all night. In the morning, he went down to the frozen creek bed and came back with flat stones stacked in his jacket. He set them carefully inside the stove, building a crooked wall that forced the fire to curl around the rock before reaching the vent. When he lit it again, the change was immediate. The flames burned steadier. The metal stayed warm longer. The shelter didn't lose its heat as fast. Lily smiled for the first time in days. "You just taught fire how to behave." "Don't tell it that," Ethan said. "It'll get offended." They kept improving the space in small, stubborn ways. Ethan cut a narrow vent into the back wall and covered it with wooden slats he could slide open or shut. On warmer afternoons, he let smoke escape. On bitter nights, he sealed it tight and let the warmth sink into the dirt. Lily found a roll of canvas behind the diner and turned it into a thick entrance curtain. She sewed extra layers into their blanket using thread traded from a woman at the laundromat. She arranged their supplies in neat rows. Beans here, flour there, firewood stacked like silent soldiers. The pit began to look less like a hole and more like a room. At night, they sat near the stove and talked about things they hadn't dared to talk about before. "What would you build if we had real tools?" Lily asked. "A house with a porch," Ethan said without hesitation. "One that doesn't sink into the ground." "Does it have windows?" "Big ones." She nodded seriously. "I want a table. A real one, not a crate." They worked during the day and planned at night. The routine shaped them into something steadier. Less scared, more deliberate. Still, the town kept its distance. A woman at the grocery store whispered that they were reckless. A man at the gas station said the roof would cave in under snow. Kids from the high school laughed when they saw Ethan's boots patched with duct tape. Ethan heard it all and said nothing. One afternoon, he came back with a stack of old boards from a torn-down shed and reinforced the roof again. Lily lined the walls with more straw and pressed wet clay over it to seal the drafts. The shelter grew warmer, quieter, heavier with their effort. It held their heat. It held their silence. One night, a sharp windstorm hit. Pine branches snapped outside. Snow piled against the entrance. Inside, the stove glowed red and steady. Lily looked around the tiny space. The hanging socks, the stacked wood, the patched walls. "It doesn't feel like we're hiding anymore," she said. Ethan leaned back against the dirt wall. What does it feel like? She thought for a second. Like we belong to it, and it belongs to us. He nodded. The pit had stopped being just a shelter. It had become proof. Proof that two kids could outthink the cold. Proof that quiet work could answer loud doubt. Proof that survival could turn into something that almost looked like a future. Outside, Red Hollow slept behind closed doors. Inside, the fire stayed. The storm arrived without warning. One night, the wind shifted and began to howl through the trees like something alive. By morning, the sky had turned a hard, colorless white, and snow fell in thick, blinding sheets. Red Hollow disappeared behind a curtain of ice. Ethan and Lily stayed inside the pit, feeding the stove carefully, watching the glow spread across the walls they had packed with clay and straw. The fire held. The heat lingered. Outside, the world was coming apart. By the second day, the wind slammed against the roof so hard the boards groaned. Snow piled up around the entrance, pressing against Lily's canvas curtain. Ethan climbed out twice to shovel it away, his face stinging raw, his fingers stiff as wood. Each time he came back inside, Lily handed him a cup of warm water and wrapped his hands in the blanket until the feeling returned. "I don't like this," she said quietly as the shelter shook. "It'll pass," Ethan said, though he wasn't sure. On the third morning, the wind finally died. They pushed open the entrance and stepped into a world buried waist-deep in snow. The fence near the pit had vanished. The trees bent low under white weight. When Ethan looked toward Red Hollow, he frowned. There's barely any smoke. That wasn't normal. In winter, the town always looked like it was breathing, chimneys puffing gray into the sky. Now it looked still, too still. They strapped on the crude snowshoes Ethan had made from bent branches and rope and started walking. It took twice as long as usual. When they reached town, the damage was clear. Two roofs had collapsed under the snow. The church chimney had cracked and filled the building with smoke. Families crowded into the grocery store and diner, wrapped in coats and blankets, their faces pale and tired. Mr. Harris from the hardware store stood outside, rubbing his arms. When he saw Ethan and Lily, his eyes widened. "You're alive," he said. "We thought—" He stopped himself. "What happened?" Lily asked. "Chimneys blocked. Fires won't draw. We can't keep places warm." Ethan and Lily exchanged a look. "Our pit," Lily said suddenly. "It still holds heat." Mr. Harris stared at her. "That hole in the ground. It's small," Ethan said, "but it works." Within an hour, they led 4 children back through the snow. 2 brothers, a little girl, and a boy who couldn't stop shivering. The kids looked terrified, clinging to their coats, afraid of the cold and the strange shelter waiting for them. Inside the pit, Lily sat them near the stove and wrapped them in blankets. Ethan added wood to the fire and adjusted the vent. The heat spread slowly, steady and real. The shaking stopped first, then the crying. Lily cooked thin porridge and fed them one by one. The shelter felt smaller than ever, but warmer too, full of breath and quiet voices and relief. That night, the pit held more than fire. It held trust. The next morning, they walked the children back to town. People were waiting. Parents, neighbors, even the ones who used to whisper. Their faces were lined with exhaustion and something else that looked a lot like shame. A woman stepped forward and took her daughter's hand from Lily's. "Thank you," she said. Her voice cracked. Mr. Harris pressed a small pouch into Ethan's palm. "For the wood? For the stove? For—" "All of it." Ethan hesitated, then closed his fingers around it. After that, things shifted. People didn't cross the street to avoid them anymore. They nodded. They spoke. They asked questions about the pit, about the stove, the walls, the roof. That shelter everyone mocked had done what brick and shingles could not. It had kept people alive. And Red Hollow would not forget it. After the blizzard, Red Hollow moved differently. People walked slower. They spoke softer. Roofs were repaired, chimneys cleared, and the town's breath, thin gray smoke, returned to the sky. But something else had changed too. When Ethan and Lily walked down Main Street, heads no longer turned away. They turned toward them. Mr. Harris offered them a small room above the hardware store. Just one window, 2 cots, and a narrow stove in the corner. It wasn't much, but it was warm and dry, and it didn't smell like dirt and frost. The first night they slept there, Lily kept waking up, surprised by the quiet. "It feels strange not hearing the wind," she whispered. Ethan smiled in the dark. "Give it time." They didn't abandon the pit. They went back to it one last afternoon, standing at the edge of the snow-melted ground where it had kept them alive. The stove was still there. The walls still held their fingerprints in dried clay. We should leave it, Lily said, in case someone needs it. Ethan nodded. Like we did. They carried only what they needed. Blankets, tools, the small pouch of money Mr. Harris had insisted on giving them. The pit stayed behind, quiet and waiting. Life didn't turn perfect overnight. Ethan began helping a local carpenter after school hours, learning how to cut joints and measure boards. Lily worked with a woman who baked bread for the diner, trading flour for lessons and stories. They were still careful with food, still cautious with trust. But now they had routines that didn't revolve around survival alone. One evening, a knock came at their door. A young boy stood in the hallway, no older than 8, his coat too thin for the weather. Mr. Harris said you could help, he said. My mom's stove won't light. Ethan and Lily followed him through the cold to a small house on the edge of town. The chimney was clogged, the firebox empty. Ethan cleared the vent. Lily built a careful flame. Warmth returned to the room, and the boy's mother closed her eyes in relief. On the walk back, Ethan said quietly, "It's going to keep happening." Lily nodded. "I know." And that was how it started. Not as heroes, not as legends, just as 2 kids who knew how to keep a fire alive. Weeks passed. Winter loosened its grip. Snow melted into muddy streets and running water. Red Hollow felt less like a place people survived and more like a place they lived. One night, as they sat by the stove in their little room, Lily asked, "Do you think we'll always remember the pit?" Ethan thought about the cold floor, the patched roof, the first warm night. "I think we have to," he said. "It's the first thing we ever built that didn't belong to anyone else." She smiled. "Then it's kind of like our beginning. They didn't know where they would end up, but they knew how they got here. And maybe that's the part that matters most. So let me ask you, if you were in their place, would you have stayed in town or risked building something on your own? Do you think survival is about strength or about learning how to help others when you finally can? If this story moved you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more emotional, true-to-life stories about resilience, kindness, and quiet courage. Because sometimes the smallest shelter can build the strongest future.